This was Iroquois in the mid-1950s, a peaceful and picturesque community nestled on the north shore of the St. Lawrence. But under the peaceful appearance, there was apprehension and uncertainty. The St. Lawrence Seaway project, having been in the discussion stages for years, was about to become reality. When the 800-foot lock at Iroquois was built in 1897, it was the longest one in Canada. But by the 50s, it and the others in the canal system were too small for efficient shipping operations. The gigantic project was to remove the bottleneck of the shallow 14-foot locks between Montreal and Prescott to allow ocean-going ships to reach inland ports. At the same time, a huge power station would be built to take advantage of the head pond that would be created when the St. Lawrence was rerouted. In preparation for the giant construction project to take place on Point Iroquois, a larger and heavier bridge had to be built across the old Gallup Canal. Farms and cottages were destroyed to make room for the new canal that would slice through the point and for the control dam that would stretch across the river to Point Rockaway on the U.S. side. The first sod was turned in August 1954, and Iroquois was in the path of the waters that would rise to create the massive inland waterway and power project. Plans called for the entire community to be relocated a mile north of its present location. In addition, a dam would be built at Iroquois to control the level of the water upstream, and new locks would be built to permit the passage of ocean-going ships. With the motto, "We have to go, but watch us grow," Iroquois was ready to face whatever the future held. With most of its schools, churches, and public buildings having been built in the late 1800s, Iroquois had not seen such activity and progress in generations. Now there was too much progress all at once. For some, the move to the new town site meant they would lose the homes they had been born in. Everything familiar around them was changing. Original plans had called for construction of new houses, not the relocation of existing ones. It soon became obvious to the planners that not everyone fancied leaving houses that had been in the family for generations. From an economic point of view, many people could not afford to sell their homes at the appraised value and build new ones at current prices. Many elderly people and those who were renting needed alternatives. As a result, plans were formulated to move as many of the village's houses as was practical. New public buildings, a shopping plaza, and about 100 new homes would be built. But nearly 150 houses were to be picked up from their foundations and moved by a giant house moving machine to a new foundation in the new town site. Meanwhile, about a mile north of the riverbank, a complete new community had to be laid out, with roads, sewers, water mains, and hydro services all in readiness for the construction of new homes and the relocation of existing ones. Main railway lines and highways had to be rerouted. Winter and summer, round the clock, men and machines worked as part of a large army of people involved in a project that was referred to by many as the eighth wonder of the world. The first house was moved from the Old Town site in the late summer of 1955. The whole community turned out to watch as the history-making project began. The giant house mover picked up the house hydraulically from its old foundation, cradled it on steel beams within a steel frame, and moved it to its new made-to-measure foundation. This house was moved to its present location on Caldwell Drive under the watchful eye of dozens of TV and newspaper reporters. For a time, Iroquois was in the eye of the nation, with news crews recording the move of entire households, often in as little as a day or two, and without even having to take the pictures off the walls. Those houses that were too large for the house-moving machine were lifted off their foundations, placed on dollies, and carefully hauled to the new community. These stately homes are now located on Victoria Street in the west end of Iroquois, and with mature trees in an established neighborhood, it's hard to believe that they spent their first decades in another location. Once the house was on its new site, a new outside chimney was built, a furnace installed, wiring and plumbing hooked up, and porches rebuilt. Where necessary, interior and exterior painting and decoration were done, and a new lawn was planted. Within a year, streets had been paved, sidewalks built, and trees planted. Mixed in with the houses that were moved from the old town were new ones, most built for people who had chosen to sell their property to Ontario Hydro or whose homes could not be moved. Only the two streets that had a view of the river, Elizabeth Drive and Lakeview Drive, were reserved exclusively for new homes. Along with the construction of new houses and public buildings, there was a need to provide new facilities for the village's largest employer, Caldwell Linen Mills, as well as for smaller service businesses and utilities. Seaway construction dictated the need to replace all four of the churches in Iroquois. The largest of these, the United Church, had been built in 1877, and when its 75th anniversary was celebrated in 1952, Lester B. Pearson was guest speaker. Mr. Pearson's grandfather had been the Methodist pastor in Iroquois when the building was begun. The last wedding at the church took place in April 1957, when Marion Merkley married Mervyn McCarricker. Because neither the New United Church nor St. John's Anglican Church were completed before the old buildings had to be torn down, both congregations worshiped temporarily in vacant stores in the new shopping plaza. The United Church congregation used the store that became the liquor store, while the Anglican congregation held services in the store that is now Becker's. Sod turning for the New United Church took place March 31, 1957, with Reverend Gordon Dangerfield as minister. With its towering spire and clean lines, the new building quickly became a village landmark. The Knox Presbyterian Church in the new village replaces a building of a similar style that was erected in the mid-1870s. A Sunday school hall was added to the building in 1932. Reverend McClellan oversaw the transition of the church and its congregation from the old village to the new. The Roman Catholic Church in the Old Village had been built in 1917, and being of frame construction was moved to the new community, where it has become the core of the present Legion Hall. The congregation, under the leadership of Father Terrian, built a new church, which is located on College Street, adjacent to St. Cecilia's separate school. The oldest church building in the community was St. John's Anglican Church, having been built in the mid-1850s. The nearby rectory was built in 1876. Like the other stone and brick churches, St. John's was demolished to make way for the Seaway project. The cornerstone of the new church, located on Lakeview Drive, was laid in the fall of 1957. The first wedding, that of Marion Fitzsimmons and Bill Reed, took place the next year with Rector Ralph Smith officiating. Like the churches of the village, the elementary and secondary schools were of course too large and too old to consider moving. The public school had been built in 1876 at a total cost then of $7,650. A typical design for its period, the school will be best remembered by many former students for its tubular fire escape installed in 1947. The high school was built 10 years later in 1886 to replace an earlier building that was first known as the Matilda County Grammar School. During the construction of the new village, youngsters from both the old and new town sites attended classes in the Iroquois Public and High School. Buses carried students of all ages from the new town site through mud and dust to the schools in the old village. By the end of the school year in June 1957, little was left standing in the village except the old schools. Teachers shouted to make themselves heard over the sound of construction, and youngsters were kept indoors as huge trucks and earth movers rumbled through the schoolyard. To replace the stately, near-century-old elementary and secondary schools, new buildings, complete with gymnasiums and all the latest features, were built and ready to open when the new school term began in the fall of 1957. Adding to the education scene in the village was St. Cecilia's separate school. The Main Street shopping district of Old Iroquois was situated almost at the water's edge. To replace the rows of stores, a sprawling new one-level shopping plaza was built. Businesses were connected by a common canopy that protected shoppers from the weather as they went from one store to another. If there appears to be an emphasis on the construction and relocation of the Bank of Montreal, remember that this film was all shot and provided to the village of Iroquois by Florence Hodgert. Her husband was the manager of a local branch of the bank, and he appears in many of the bank's scenes. Also recognizable in the scenes of the shopping plaza relocation are Ed Fitzsimmons and Ron Fader. The plaza was officially opened in May of 1957 with a ceremony presided over by the then Premier of Ontario, Leslie Frost. It was a proud day for Iroquois, with a $1 million shopping centre that was the most modern in Eastern Ontario. But the paint was barely dry when thieves broke into Federley's garage, stole the tow truck, and used it to rip out the front of the S&F grocery store. They attached the store's safe to the truck and hauled it away to be opened at their convenience. The safe was later found and took a prominent position in the village's centennial parade that same summer. The transformation from construction site to finished community was over. And with paved streets, new sidewalks, and rows of neatly painted older homes and sparkling new ones, the village was almost complete. The only thing missing was trees. These too were planted, but it would be many years before the tidy streets began to look like a real hometown. When the last of the homes that could be moved were relocated, and when the merchants had moved to the new shopping plaza, what remained of the old village resembled a ghost town. Anything of value was salvaged from the deserted buildings before the demolition began in earnest. Bulldozers attacked century-old buildings, and with the help of controlled burning, local history disappeared. It was an emotional experience for many, seeing fire consume buildings that had been homes, businesses, part of their lives for generations. But through all the upheaval and emotional roller coaster that accompanied the move, the people of Iroquois took time out to honor their past. The summer of 1957 marked the centennial of the community. Because Iroquois had not had the required population of 750 people in 1857, a special act of incorporation had to be passed. Before its incorporation, the post office name had been Matilda and the village was called Cathcart. Only the point had been called Iroquois, named for the Indians who had camped there years before. Among the events that centennial summer were a pie-eating contest in the new shopping plaza, an outdoor meeting of village council, and the laying of the cornerstone of the new civic center. But the highlight was a parade that featured entries by local businesses and organizations. Floats in the parade represented most businesses in the village. Some of them seen here are still active. Along with Federley's, we see Fitzsimmons, S&F Foods with their Gone But Not Forgotten safe, Fitzsimmons Funeral Home, Ambulance and Furniture, the Bank of Montreal, Caldwell Linens, Gilder's Jewelry, S.A. Thompson Lumber, Ontario Hydro, and Van Allen's Garage. Meanwhile, all during that summer of 1957, an army of huge trucks worked around the clock, carrying earth from the point and filling in low ground between the old and new town site. The earth came from the massive construction project that had been going on at the same time as the relocation of the village. A new control dam was being built across the St. Lawrence from Point Rockaway on the U.S. side to Point Iroquois on the Canadian side. This would hold back the waters of the river west of Iroquois and control the level of Lake Ontario. Thousands of pounds of explosives blasted a huge cut through Point Iroquois, marking the location of the canal and lock that would bypass the new control dam. Prior to the construction of the Seaway, lake boats had to pass through the locks at Iroquois on their way upstream in the Gallup Canal. Eastbound ships came around Point Iroquois and continued downstream. With the construction of the dam, the new larger locks would accommodate both lakers and ocean-going ships in both directions. Men and machines worked around the clock, pouring concrete, building forms, and moving earth. By late 1957, construction of the lock was complete, and downriver near Cornwall, a similar project was underway on the U.S. side at the Eisenhower Lock. Change was evident everywhere. The old Gallup Canal, site of the boathouses today, was drained to expose the workings of the village's original electric powerhouse. On July 1st, 1958, all was in readiness. At 8 o'clock that morning, a huge dynamite blast near Cornwall opened the temporary coffer dam that held back the waters of the St. Lawrence. With the control dam in place at Cornwall, the new head pond for the power project began to form. Within a day, the river had risen to its new level, and areas that had once been home to hundreds of people had disappeared under the water forever. A new shoreline was formed, and the master plan of the designers took shape. The new locks at Iroquois provided a sharp contrast to the ones they replaced. Manpower, formerly used to swing the bridge and open and close the lock gates, was used only to secure the lines that tied up ships as they waited for the lock gates to open. The largest of ocean-going freighters and the longest lakers could pass through with ease. With the project complete by 1959, an official opening was planned for late June of that year. On hand with other dignitaries was Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth. She first visited Cornwall to open the new Saunders Power project, while the Royal Yacht Britannia made its way upriver. Then she drove through the relocated communities, stopping finally at Iroquois. Her arrival was preceded by the assembly of virtually the entire community. Bands, local dignitaries, Boy Scouts, all assembled in the shopping plaza on a hot, sultry June afternoon. They weren't disappointed when the Queen and Prince Philip arrived to be greeted by Reeve Lloyd Davis and members of Village Council. The Queen was presented with flowers by young Barb Fetterly, daughter of Councillor Jack Fetterly. Other members of Council on hand for the occasion included C.V. Ellis, Byron Saver, and Harry Gilmer, and their wives. It was a proud moment for everyone concerned. The village had begun its transformation 5 years earlier with the motto, "We have to go, but watch us grow." It had survived and was heading into its second century with high hopes for the future and a unique respect for its past.